Hello and welcome to People Making Money, one of the Way to Wow shows. And I'm Kevin Bemmel, your host, and we're here every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific Time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, which is relevant to our guest today, Ben Inman. Um, and Ben and I actually met. I was introduced to him through another guest of mine, Michael Zwick, who was on my Monday show, Trust and Estates Weekly. And Ben's primary business is as an estate planning lawyer. But in talking, Ben mentioned he has a kind of a niche specialty in, of all things, firearms commerce and law. And I think this is, for me anyway, who lives in California, where the laws of firearms commerce are very, very strict. I think this is an interesting subject to tackle. I mean, we're not going to be getting into the politics of, gun control and that kind of stuff. We're really going to be talking about how one, deals in the sale and purchase and the ownership of firearms. And I think it's an important subject for us to learn about. Especially because we've seen firearm ownership continue to grow and grow and grow, especially over the last few years. And I think it's important that whether we own firearms or not, we know how to deal with them properly and safely. That was always what my dad taught me. My dad was a small arms instructor for many, 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 many years. So I'm really pleased to welcome you, Ben, to talk about this subject and to help us really understand it better. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me on, Kevin. It's one of the things that I'm really excited to talk about, which is why I actually decided to add that as part of my practice, is because, I do have a passion for firearms. My dad taught me to shoot when, I got my first BB gun when I was 6, and all growing up hunting. And then I joined the Army when I was 19 before I graduated high school, and started, and kept right on through it. And so I've just incorporated as part of my practice once I became a lawyer.
Yeah. And I think you're maybe a little bit younger than I am, but I think we came from a generation of fathers who, almost as kind of a rite of passage, expected their sons to learn how to handle firearms. I know when I was in the Boy Scouts, I was probably 11 years old, going to scout camp. And one of the highlights was going to, the rifle range and learning how to fire. They were just, your basic 22 caliber, bolt action rifles, real simple weapons. But I know for me and all of my scout buddies, the time we got to spend on the range was, it was just the highlight, of being at scout camp, right? But it was great because, we had to make sure that we did everything safely and all of that. And so we were brought up with that. And this was despite my mother's absolute abhorrence,
I totally understand that. Dealing with that a bit myself. My wife feels similar to how your mom does. And I got my 2 older boys who are 10 and 8. Went to Cub Scout camp last year, and they got to do the BB guns, and they were very excited about doing that. But mom was less so excited.
Yeah. We were not allowed to have any firearms in our house when I was growing up as a kid. I think the only thing my father liked about the divorce from my mother was that he could own firearms again. So, but yeah, and as an adult, one of the activities I most enjoyed with my father was going to the range, both indoor and outdoor. He had some really, beautiful firearms. He had a lever action Browning rifle that was just, it was a dream to fire that weapon. I want to take you back a little bit though, before we
Mhm.
get into the real farm stuff, and just so people understand a little bit about your background. You mentioned, joining the Army before you graduated high school. So what led you to decide to, become a service member, join the military, as a teenager, basically, right?
Yeah. Well, for me, there was a couple things. One is so during I was a senior in high school on September 11th, 2001, and so in April of 2002, I started looking at graduating from high school, and that's when I joined the Army. But I started looking at that had happened, and then how I was going to pay for college. I didn't come from a family that was going to be able to afford to pay for college, so there was a pretty good offer from Uncle Sam to join the Army, and they would pay for college. And it actually turned out even better than I initially thought, because after I joined, we got the post 9/11 GI Bill, and all the benefits really increased substantially for education after that. So
Mhm.
it really worked out phenomenally for my undergrad.
Yeah. And that's interesting because I joined the Navy essentially for the same reason, because I was in Washington D.C. on September 11th.
Mm-hmm.
I've told this story before, but I was with a group. We were in the Capitol Rotunda when the Pentagon got hit, and that was my rationale. You're walking the streets of Washington D.C., and there's young National Guardsmen on the corner with M16s, right? And you don't think this is not the United States of America. I know. So yeah, so that's interesting. So then you're how long were you in the Army?
I served 7 years in the New Hampshire Army National Guard.
Oh, okay.
Yep,
And you were enlisted, I take it then, since you said you hadn't gone to college.
correct. Yep, I enlisted. I started in the engineers. I was an interior electrician
Oh,
with the engineers when I started. Yeah.
huh? Cool.
So it was a lot of it. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot of things. It obviously wasn't all fun, but there's a lot of times where it's just it is service, and it's tough. But I really appreciate the experience of having gone through it, even deploying to Afghanistan for a year, and
Mhm.
the experience of living in a combat zone for a year on the ground. It definitely impacted the way I view the world and how I understand
Mhm.
things. So it really is, all in all, a great experience, even though there were times that were extraordinarily tough.
Yes. Yeah. Same with my Navy service. I think that's pretty true of almost all service members. So after 7 years, what made you decide to, get out of the Army and sort of take the next steps of your life?
Well, at that point, I was graduating from college. I had already deployed once to Afghanistan, but I had also deployed. I deployed what, 3 times inside the United States. There were two floods that I got deployed for, as well as an ice storm.
Oof.
And then I had also gotten called out for Katrina, and to go out to Katrina, but I got turned around at the last minute because I was in line processing through, and they were like, "Nope, stop. We've got all the people who are going. Go
Okay.
back to your lives." So you know, but it was definitely a different time,
Mhm.
because of the fast pace of deployments for National Guard. I wasn't a full-time soldier, and we got put on 4-hour recall to be
Uh-huh.
ready to go anywhere. And having that and going through the experience of deploying and seeing uh, a lot of the other members of my unit coming back, and probably more than half of them were divorced by the time we got back from that deployment, and knowing that I didn't want to necessarily have that go through that with my family.
Yeah. I think for a lot of Americans, they don't quite understand, what is the National Guard? They think they hear National Guard, but it's actually more like sort of state militia that then kind of gets activated. I have a longstanding close friend who was in the Guard for I think about 28 years. He retired, I believe it was last year. And in some ways, it's a harder life than being in the Army itself because of the way you sort of bounce back and forth between civilian life and military life, and the sort of upheaval it causes. I found much more upheaval in my life as a reservist than I did as an active duty service member. So I'm wondering what was your experience? Well, I guess you did some active duty time, right? So
I mean, I only did active duty time while I was deployed. So I got activated for, whatever it was, 16 months or something to deploy to Afghanistan.
Right.
So, but yeah, I mean, so just to kind of flesh that out a little bit. So the National Guard, there's three components of the United States Army. There's the active component, reserve component, and then the National Guard. So we're kind of separated off. And it is a little weird because there's kind of the two channels for the chain of command. There's the big Army channel that goes up to the president when you're on Title 10 orders or deployed. And then there's always the state on the backside, because that's who you're actually connected to. And all the promotions are dependent on back in your state. So there's it's not as straightforward as it is with the reserves or with the active Army of what your chain of command is, because everybody's still kind of always looking back and being like, well, what did they think about it?
Right.
Whether I get the next promotion is up to them. It's not up to you.
Right.
I just got to avoid not getting demoted by you.
Right. I mean, there are somewhat similar things, like when we go on, sort of temporary orders, I mean, to a certain extent, it was, like you said, it's like, as long as I don't like majorly mess up, I'm fine. Cause it's really this guy over here who decides, my fate. So, there are a lot of sort of, I don't want to call it politics per se, but that sort of, dual loyalty and such.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
memories.
I sometimes describe it, it's just office politics to some degree about exactly, how it all works, and not necessarily politics in the sense of like, national politics.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So 7 years, you have your degree, you leave the National Guard, and what was your degree in? I assume it's a bachelor's degree, right?
Yeah, I got a bachelor's degree in political science. So it was not incredibly useful, but I had previously planned on, my plan had been to, once I graduated from college, go active Army and become an officer. But because I had a pretty serious girlfriend at the time and wanted to eventually start a family, and we were still at that point, it's 2007, 2008, excuse me. We're, still very much in the war on terror. Iraq is going on, Afghanistan's going on heavily.
Right.
And so there's no let up in sight of, well, what, if I were to do that, what's life really going to look like?
Right.
And then on top of that, the financial crisis as I'm graduating from college. And so my other background was in construction, because I did that on the civilian side outside of college. My uncle owned a construction company, so I worked for them. And then in the Army, I did construction. By that point, I was a construction supervisor. And, there were no jobs in construction, in addition to there's never really jobs for political science majors, but, there's, jobs that just require a 4-year degree, you can usually get into them. So there just was not a lot out there. So I kind of looked around and tried to figure out what I could do. I had a girlfriend who was dead set on going to law school, and we visited a couple, and I got interested in national security law because I thought it would be a good fit with what I had done previously and have some exposure to that and some practical experience with, how that actually looks on the ground as opposed to, back in an office in DC.
Right.
So I thought that would be the way to go. And then I was able to get a job working for a domestic relations firm in Dover, New Hampshire, while I was applying to law school. So I got a little bit of experience there and kind of caught the trial bug, seeing him go to court and doing all the court stuff. And I eventually focused my education in law school on that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Where'd you go to law school?
George Mason University School of Law. Now it's Antonin Scalia School of Law.
Right. Wow. Okay. So this is like big time law school. So, yeah. Very cool. So now you're out of law school, and what is your career? Your early career look like?
So I got hired by the Arlington Commonwealth Attorney's Office, which in Virginia is the prosecutor's office. They handle everything from your ordinary traffic cases all the way up to capital murder. So getting to go in there and getting to get the experience in, a large county that had, 700,000. I know out by you, maybe that's not that huge, but that, generally speaking, 700,000 people in a county is pretty big. Mm-hmm. And it was a great experience, tons of trial experience. I got to try, literally hundreds of cases. The best I can do is estimate on it, like to that level. Cause there were days when I might've tried I think I tried 5 cases was the most I tried in a single day.
In a single day?
Yeah.
Wow.
Bouncing from different courts. But they aren't all capital murder.
Still.
A lot of them are, much more pedestrian things. Some of them might be, I might go try a traffic case and then have to do an assault and battery or whatever. But
still keeping it all straight, bouncing 5 different courtrooms. I mean, that's wild.
Exactly.
Wow.
So that was great. And then moved on. And actually, maybe I should explain a little bit more how that fits into the firearms law. So one of my collateral duties while I was a prosecutor was firearms. So I was one of the people who would review the applications for concealed carry permits. I would be the person who would go in and represent the Commonwealth when it came to certain firearms issues. So in Virginia, if you're convicted of a felony, like most places, you lose your civil rights. In Virginia, you can pretty easily get those rights restored, except for your firearms rights. The firearms rights they pull off, and you have to go through a separate process. You have to apply to the circuit court, and you have to convince a judge that there's good cause to restore your rights. And so I would represent the Commonwealth's position in those cases and litigate those as they came up. So they didn't come up all that frequently, but I got to deal with some of the firearms law there, as well as I had been the liaison to the Virginia State Police, and because they handle the applications for people who go in and try and purchase firearms. Well, I shouldn't say applications, the background check information. When the state police had questions about something that was going on, they might come in and ask me questions about an ongoing investigation into someone who, whether or not they should be further investigated because perhaps they're a prohibited person, meaning under the law, there are certain people who are not allowed to own or possess firearms, such as convicted felons generally. And so we consult on those cases and help them in their investigations to see whether charges were warranted or whether it was even an unlawful purchase, because sometimes the records aren't 100% correct. So it's just chasing down evidence to try and verify what had occurred.
So a convicted felon loses his right to possess a firearm. Does the conviction have to be relate to some kind of violent act, or like if someone is convicted of, say, felony fraud, that would also warrant that restriction? How broad is the is that restriction?
Extraordinarily broad. So it's so broad that it isn't the felony thing is just shorthand. So it's actually any crime that's punishable by more than a year in incarceration.
Oh.
So that's a surprise to a lot of people, because here in Northern Virginia, we have a close by jurisdiction of Maryland, which you can have a misdemeanor assault that could carry 2 years incarceration. So being convicted of that could cause you to lose your firearms rights. But I don't know how much that actually gets enforced that way. I've never seen it be enforced that way, but it certainly is. Some things do fall through the cracks. I've litigated cases where, so in addition to the felonies, there's also anyone who's convicted of violence against a family member, but there's kind of specific definitions of how that works, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But under federal law, they don't care what the actual charge is. Under federal law, it only matters that there was a crime of misdemeanor, either assault or battery, and that the victim of that is, a wife, an ex-wife, a child, one of your children, and there's other people who are enumerated in that, and it doesn't matter whether that's charged as just an ordinary assault and battery, or whether it's charged as what we term domestic assault and battery here in Virginia. So, and because there is, under that other terminology, a wider umbrella, because anyone who could be a family or household member isn't necessarily, the definitions overlap, but they're not the same. So you could be convicted of domestic assault and battery against a sibling, but not be prohibited under federal law from owning or possessing firearms.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Okay.
Yeah,
That seems like
sorts of weird wrinkles that show up. I mean, originally that was passed under the Violence Against Women Act, and that's where it was coming from, was to try and prevent the escalation of violence from domestic assault up to murder with a firearm, or attempted murder, or serious assaults. So that's was kind of the thinking at the time originally, although it is a bit broader than that. So,
and does it apply for a wife who commits violence against a husband?
Yes. So it really is just anybody convicted of crimes of violence against a domestic partner.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. So it is quite. It can be broad, but also can be narrow depending on the circumstances. And I think there's quite a bit of misunderstanding on some of those finer points that I'm making there, even among people who might otherwise know, particularly law enforcement. I've litigated a case at one point involving a person who was convicted of a domestic assault against his brother, he wasn't prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms, but at the same time, law enforcement probably was just going to see, the way that shows up on a conviction sheet, it just shows up as domestic A and B, and wanting to make sure that he wasn't going to end up in handcuffs, even though he was legally in possession of firearms. And so we had litigated that issue. Actually, we brought it in front of the circuit court on we did an application for a concealed carry permit. Not that he was necessarily all that interested in it, but it was a way to get it in front of a judge. And now you've got the Commonwealth of Virginia having litigated a case that was decided by a judge on the other side. And so, felt pretty good about being able to make sure he's not going to get arrested when he shouldn't be.
Right. Wow. So, and you mentioned that the law is actually much broader, that it really applies to anyone who or any offense that has a year or more of jail time. Is it that the offense has that as a mandatory minimum? Is it the sentence that the person actually received when they were found guilty? How is that rule applied?
So it's based on the sentencing range. So it's based on whether you could be sentenced to more than a year incarceration for the charge.
Okay.
So generally speaking, misdemeanors are less than 12 months incarceration. They're also typically incarceration in the jail as opposed to the state penitentiary. Penitentiary tends to hold the longer term prisoners who are there on felony charges. And even a lot of felonies, given the amount of time they end up serving, they actually just serve it in the jail. It's only if they're on longer term, because it takes a while to process them out, and the cost of transporting people back and forth from there. And, it just doesn't necessarily make sense. So, but people do want to a lot of prisoners want to get transferred to prison if they're going to be there for a long time anyways, because there are different programs that they might be able to reduce their sentences or do other things that are beneficial to them.
So at least in theory, a crime could be eligible for up to, say, 2 or 3 years in prison, but the person is only sentenced to 9 months, but that would still render them ineligible for possessing a firearm then, huh?
Yeah, I mean, you could see rather frequently. So people convicted of a lot of felonies don't end up spending any time incarcerated, other than processing time. Somebody who has no other record and is convicted of possessing a small amount of cocaine, for instance, or some other drug, it's a felony, but chances are they're going to end up in some form of probation. In Virginia, you get a suspended incarceration sentence. That's how they handle probation. So, if you violate, you're facing up to whatever they put for the suspended incarceration sentence. So, you can't go above that, but at the same time, you can end up serving that entire time. So it's a pretty big stick for trying to get people to go to drug treatment, for instance, when you're talking about drug cases, the fear that they might actually have to go to jail for a while or prison.
Right. Okay. So we've gotten off your career track a little bit.
Sorry.
No, it's fine, because I was asking the questions, but so you were with the Alexandria
Arlington County.
Arlington. Okay.
Yep.
And so then how did you go from there to private practice, which is what you're doing now, right? And how did you go from being a prosecutor to being involved in estate planning and trusts and estates and all that, that seems really kind of a a weird shift.
Yeah. So one of the things that happened was I had a friend from law school who had a case that he said was going to go to jury trial in federal court in the Eastern District of Virginia. He felt sure it was going to a jury. It was against the Department of Defense, the Defense Security Service. And so he asked me if I wanted to come over and do a big federal jury trial against DOD and, the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I was like, I've tried a lot of cases, but I've never tried a federal jury trial. Like, yes, I want to come over and do that. That sounds like a lot of fun. And so I joined his firm and we tried that case and we won, and it was great. But ultimately I kind of figured out I don't really like practicing employment law on the plaintiff side, at least. And so it got to be about COVID time, 2020, and we did the you remember there was supposed to be like the 2-week or 3-week crush the curve. We're going to just take a couple weeks off. And I was like, well, everything's paused. There's no court. There's nothing. Like, if I'm going to make the transition, because I had been thinking about it for a while, now's the time. Because part of it was also my personal finance journey. I had gotten involved with Dave Ramsey's Baby Steps. And so I had been paying off my debt. And actually, when I won that big jury trial against Department of Defense, I paid off all my law school debts. And that was when I had paid off all the debts that I had. And so, once you get out of debt, the next questions are, well, how do you start building wealth? And then what do you do with it once you start building wealth? And, led me kind of interestingly to the estate planning aspect. And I started getting more and more down the rabbit hole with that. And so it turned into something that, is now what my firm does. It's pretty much all I do is trust and estates practice. I do some business planning as well that goes kind of hand in hand with that, because it's really kind of one and the same thing. But, I don't get too far down into the weeds on corporate governance or anything like that. That's not where I am. But, it is really awesome. I'm enjoying it. And you get to work with some really great people, and being out on your own, I get to choose who I work with. So if I find someone I don't want to work with, I don't have to work with them. Different than working for somebody else. They pick the clients.
Right. I've talked on several occasions on this show about, starting a business and why would one do it, and what are the benefits. And I think for people who have not been in any kind of entrepreneurial or business startup venture, and starting your own law firm is certainly a business startup, the perception is, well, you're doing it to make more money. And I'm not sure that that's really the case. But what it does do is it gives you a kind of freedom that you don't have when you're working for somebody else, because, like you say, that they're dictating to a large extent the terms of your employment. So
yeah, right. Are you meeting your numbers? Like, are you meeting your billable hours, or however it is? That can be tough. The other thing that somebody had pointed out a while ago, but I don't hear people talk about it too much, is when you work for yourself, there's also a level of security that you don't necessarily get working for someone else. Because the thing is, most people think, oh, well, you have less job security working for yourself. Well, no, multiple people are coming to me from different places. If I lose one of them, I still have other places where I'm getting my money from. Whereas if you have an employer, that's it. If you get fired, there's your source of income. You got to go try and find a brand new one. So, it really gives you a little bit more security, I think, overall.
So true. And it's so great to hear someone else articulate this, because that's another point that I always try to make is, if you've got 10 clients and one of them decides to quit, or you decide to fire that client, okay, so maybe you're losing, 10% of your business, or if they're a big client, maybe it's even 20%, but you still have the other 80 or 90% left. Whereas when you work for someone, you essentially have one client, and that if that client fires you, that's it. Now your income is zero, and you're starting over again. So with the exception of my time in the Navy, I always worked for myself. And I always thought that was a much more secure employment situation. Also because in the end, right, my success came from how hard I was willing to work, how much, how often I was willing to sort of, get off my backside and do the marketing or whatever, right? It was really, much more in my hands than if I worked for someone else. So.
Yeah. And you get to create your own role to maximize your best attributes, as opposed to, oh, well, this is the role we want you in, and you're going to fit this role. Like, you can only do so much if the role doesn't fit who you are.
Yeah.
And you get the opportunity to make that working for yourself, which is also something that's great. You can play to your strengths and do your best to minimize your weaknesses, whereas you could end up in the opposite, working for somebody else. They have a need that you need to be somewhere. You've got to be there, even if it's not what you're good at or what you choose to do.
Right, right. And when it's your own practice or your own business, you can always hire someone to cover your weaknesses who has that as their strength, right? I mean, that ideally that's what we do, and it's I mean, it's like I said, it's great to hear, that these ideas, coming from another source. So see, people, I'm not crazy. What I've been telling you all these years actually bears out in fruit. So what was it like, initially starting your own practice and going from, getting that paycheck to, right, building up your clientele and all of that?
Yeah, it is scary. You start out and there's not really a whole lot going on, and you're hoping people are going to hire you, and you talk to people and you have good conversations, and it seems like it's going somewhere, and then you hear nothing. And then, it takes a little while, and some of those people you hear back from, and then you get hired down the line. I've noticed that there's a lot of ups and downs when it comes to business. There are times when it seems like nothing's going on, and then I've had lulls where I'm like, I don't know, like, whether I'm going to have any more clients. Like, I kind of get to the end of all the work that I have to do and look around and start worrying, and but then you get, it all happens at one time. I don't know why. It's almost like they're coordinated, because you end up with, from absolutely nothing to now everybody wants to hire you all on the same day. All the contract gets signed, all the retainers get funded. And now you're like, how am I going to get all this work done? Maybe I've promised these people deadlines over time that now there's, everybody has these tight deadlines, so you go back and forth between the two of them sometimes.
Right. It's kind of feast or famine, right?
Yeah, a bit like that. Hopefully my goal is to try and smooth some of that out over time.
Yeah. I mean, all I can tell you is, in my experience, it does smooth out, but it takes a few years to sort of, get it that way. But yeah, it does. But, life is a roller coaster fundamentally, right? So yeah, definitely. Especially with having 4 kids, it's just trying to balance that with everything else is craziness sometimes. And just out of curiosity, you mentioned your girlfriend, you said, was dead set on going to law school. Is that the woman you married? Or
no.
Oh, okay.
Her and I broke up, but fortunately we broke up, and I met my wife at law school. At the beginning of law school, we started out as friends, and then started to become more than friends, and we got married while I was still in law school. But it's law school is a very special place, and if you don't, I think a lot of people show up there not realizing what lawyers actually do for a living.
Yes. I was a law clerk after I got out of college, because my mother was working for a lawyer, and I got out of college with an architecture degree at a time where there was a building recession, basically. And so I thought about going to law school. And so it gave me an opportunity to see what it was like to, practice law before going to law school. And yeah, it's people see TV shows and they think this is what it's like, and it's really not.
Yeah, exactly. It's like an episode of Suits, they think, or
Yeah.
No, you're not making some grand argument in front of the Supreme Court. That's like you're talking something really basic in a local court, and that's just the way it is. It's gonna somebody's arbitrary grievance, but they're really dead set on that's an important issue.
Yes.
Is much more likely to be part of your life as a lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. So, so you started your own firm. You're working trusts and estates, estate planning, and how did you bring the firearms aspect kind of back into your practice? Because now you're not representing, the state anymore, basically. So,
Mhm.
how did that come back in?
Well, I had identified one of the areas that I thought would be helpful was for me as in growing my business, which was to kind of focus more on firearms stuff because of my background. And so I had focused quite a bit of my marketing effort on that. And I was thinking more initially along the lines of, because I had transitioned and didn't have much experience in estate planning, is okay, well, I'll pick up some criminal cases on the side, or while I'm making the transition, that I can go try some criminal cases. Those aren't going to be too difficult for me. I can pick and choose what I want. So I had decided that I was going to do that, and I thought trying to make some contacts within the firearms world and becoming affiliated with these different groups that maybe made referrals for criminal defense attorneys might be particularly for self-defense shootings and things like that would be beneficial. And so I did that, and people started coming in. But then because I was getting to be known for firearms law, I'd get other things too, like felons who had been convicted who wanted to get their firearms rights restored might contact me and ask me if I could take their case and go litigate it. Yeah, I've got experience in that. I've probably done more of those than most other people you'll find in the area. I don't think it's an area of particular specialty because there's just not that much work in it. But I started taking those, and then I started adding in the firearms trusts and started to get to know more and more about the National Firearms Act and some of the other firearms related acts that are out there. So it really, just kind of blossomed from there. And I think it gives me some common ground to talk about with other clients too, because sometimes there's a lot of high net worth clients out there who maybe are very much so into firearms, and being able to have discussions with them about their firearms, it tends to be one of those topics that if you're really into it, you really want to talk about it. So, being able to kind of use that was another area that I had thought of.
You mentioned the firearms trust. So what is that involved with, or what does that entail?
So it can mean different things. I tend to mean it particularly for National Firearms Act items. So, and National Firearms Act is usually referred to as NFA for shorthand, just because the acronym is much quicker to say. But the NFA has a particular wrinkle wherein a trust is defined as a person. And so the NFA regulates certain firearms not based on ownership or possession, but based on transfer and the taxes paid on the transfer, or also manufacture, because you can do that as well. So it operates over machine guns, short-barreled rifles, short-barreled shotguns, silencers, what are termed any other weapons. But any other weapon doesn't necessarily mean all other weapons. It just means mostly disguised weapons. So you think a cane gun, like a cane that disguises a firearm, or a desk that has a firearm built into it. Those would be any other weapons, or AOWs. And those are all regulated under the National Firearms Act. And when those get transferred, there needs to be a $200 tax paid to ATF. And that's how they regulate the transfer. You can also manufacture items such as silencers. People make their own silencers. You just have to file the paperwork with ATF and get approved prior to making it, as well as paying the tax. So it's actually a tax law, which is weird for most people because they think about, oh, well, if you were to violate it, it would be a felony. And it would be, but it's technically a tax violation, a tax felony.
Uh-huh. Huh.
But you know, it's very different because of the way the understanding was at the time that it was written, thinking that perhaps there wasn't the authority for the national government to be able to regulate firearms directly due to the Second Amendment. And so, well, we can pass these tax laws and those will be different, and it'll be such a high tax that nobody will be able to afford it. You know, it was a $200 tax back in 1934, I think it was. And, you know, back then that was a lot of money. You know, that $200 back then was a lot of money. $200 today is, you know, it's not nothing, but at the same time, it's not $10,000, I think is what inflation adjusted that roughly translates to. So, you know, that was a big impediment at the time for people to be able to purchase those firearms. And now it's come down, and firearms technology has changed over that time too. And so you end up with a lot of different things, which is how there was recently the big hullabaloo about the, whether certain firearms are short-barreled rifles or merely what are typically called AR pistols. So you could have a pistol with a shoulder brace. It's not a stock, and even though it may look like a rifle with a short barrel and a short stock, as long as you met certain parameters, it's considered a pistol, which is regulated differently from a short-barreled rifle, even though it, you know, functions the same as a full-size rifle or even a short-barreled rifle.
So a couple of minutes ago, you used the term machine gun, and I think from my experience in talking to people about firearms, I think there's at least some misconception between, you know, machine gun, automatic rifle, semi-automatic rifle, right? These are all not necessarily the same thing. Talk to us about, you know, some of those designations and how that plays into firearm law and firearm commerce.
Yeah, so there's a lot of inconsistent terminology that you'll find here, because when we talk about machine guns under the National Firearms Act, we actually mean any firearm that expels more than one projectile per pull of the trigger or per activation of the trigger, because there's also now the proliferation of what they call binary triggers. So they fire both on the pull and on the release, but those are not generally considered machine guns. But sometimes people get confused because they think, oh, well, it's not an M60 or, you know, M249, what we might call machine guns generally in the military, although the 249 was a squad automatic weapon. But, you know, those are kind of the thoughts, whereas even an ordinary M16A1 would be considered a machine gun because it was fully automatic, or even the M16A2 because it had the 3-round burst.
Okay. So a machine gun is a fully automatic weapon, right? And in general, my understanding is civilians are not permitted to own fully automatic weapons. Is that correct, or is that a misconception?
It's a bit of a misconception. So you can, as long as it is compliant under the NFA. So how that works is one of the problems is it has to be manufactured prior to a certain date, which I think is May of 1986 is when it became unlawful to manufacture further machine guns. So the supply in May of 1986 is all the supply there is of machine guns currently. So as they're destroyed or things happen to them where they're no longer capable of being used, then the supply continues to shrink, and eventually there'll be no supply. It's why, currently, if you wanted to purchase a machine gun, it costs about $10,000 for even the cheapest machine gun you might be able to find. And you've got to follow through with the National Firearms Act requirements of filing with ATF to get permission to purchase it and pay the tax. And then there's additional state requirements. Here in Virginia, you've got to register with the Virginia State Police within 24 hours of taking custody of a machine gun. And other states have similar requirements. I think for you in California, I think it's just an all-out ban, which may be why you have a different understanding of how that works. So, there's a lot of variation there on the state level with machine guns and how they're regulated. But the supply, there's no new ones there coming onto the market, at least at this point. So that's where it sits. But some people have them, and it's lawful to have them as long as they were properly possessed and registered. Because sometimes people, I don't know how often people are finding them still, but you find people, granddad came back from World War II with his Thompson, and it's been sitting in a Foot Locker for, at this point, 80 years,
Right, yeah.
or 90 years. So those can't be registered. Those are unlawful. They can only be confiscated or destroyed.
Oh.
Yeah, because so it wasn't just they had to be manufactured before that date. They also had to be registered before that date.
Oh.
So, yeah. So if they're out there and they're unregistered, it prevents any additional ones from seeping in from overseas, I suspect, would be the thinking behind it. You couldn't import them illegally and then say, oh, this has been here since World War II or whatever.
So even though a weapon like that could presumably have historical value, and it might be something that a museum would want, you couldn't turn it over to a museum, or the museum would be required to destroy it if you did, or?
I don't think so. I think that it depends. I think generally the answer is yes. If you were to turn it over because it had some kind of historic significance to, say, like one of the Army military run museums, it might be a little different. I don't know how they're regulated, but NFA only regulates firearms not in the possession of the United States government. So even local governments have to comply with NFA. They don't have to pay the tax, but they do have to comply with, we own this firearm with this serial number, and this belongs to, Arlington Police Department, and they track as those are transferred around. So it works a little bit different with the feds. I don't know how specifically internally they decide to regulate those, but it's not part of the National Firearms Act. So they could legally possess it, but whether they'd actually want to, I would suspect they would not be interested.
Oh, okay. Interesting. And so you said that, basically after whatever the date was, May 1986, they stopped manufacturing machine guns. But is that solely for civilian purchase? Because I assume the federal government, right, the military is still buying, machine guns, right? So
correct. Yeah.
Okay.
So that's only for civilian use. Even local governments and state governments can still purchase machine guns.
Oh, they can. Oh, okay.
Right. It's only in the civilian market that they're no longer able to be produced. So
this is an interesting wrinkle, because municipal governments are subject to the NFA, but yet they still can buy, new machine guns.
Right. So they're subject to the registration requirement, not necessarily the other requirements.
I see.
Just the federal government wants to know what happens with all of the machine guns in the possession of, other government entities.
Okay. And not to stray into politics, but I am curious, seem to fly in the face of the Second Amendment. That the government keeps a registry of a certain type of weapon. So one would assume there's been, challenges to those, and they've not been successful. What is the situation with that?
I'm not aware. I mean, there probably have been challenges. I just haven't read the cases. I'm not really conversant with how that ended up breaking down. I mean, we did see how that worked a couple decades ago when the federal government decided they were going to enlist local government to do the background checks for firearms purchases. And not only was it you can, it was a command that they shall. And that was rejected by the Supreme Court. And now it's been taken back over by ATF. But originally, the background checks were supposed to be handled by local law enforcement. We're supposed to run those background checks for the firearms dealers.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You've seen more and more pushback on some of these things from the Supreme Court, whether it's that or the gun-free school zones being overturned in the Supreme Court under Lopez versus United States, and some of the more recent cases, including the New York Rifle and Pistol Club, where there's saying that blanket prohibitions on firearms is not necessarily something that's permissible under the Second Amendment. So we're still waiting to see how all that's going to shake out on what's in there and what's heated. There's a lot of different things that it says, and I have my personal opinion on where I think that's going, given some of these blanket prohibitions on where the carrying of firearms, particularly all buildings owned where federal employees regularly work, seems a little overbroad because it includes bathrooms at national parks. So, it may be that we'll see changes in that regard in the future, but we'll have to wait and see where firearms can be prohibited gets pared down significantly. I would expect that it's going to remain in courthouses and prisons. Some of the other places where there's blanket prohibitions on firearms is probably less likely to be able to stand. But it's the way the law is now until we get a judge who decides otherwise.
Right, and it works its way through the whole legal system. Yeah.
Right.
So for someone who doesn't own a firearm right now, but is considering becoming a firearm owner. And by the way, it seems like anybody who's been in the military inevitably gets this question, right? Should I get a firearm, right? So I'm curious, what are your thoughts in terms of potentially, and I'm not asking you to give legal advice per se, but for someone who doesn't have a firearm but is thinking, well, maybe I need to get one for whatever, self-protection, whatever. What would you say to someone in that situation? I know what I say, but I'm curious to hear what you say.
I would recommend, first off, that they try taking some classes to learn the basics. The initial are usually starting off with some kind of safety class, but then, maybe moving forward into something where you get a little bit more experience, but you're not necessarily off on your own if you don't have any experience. I was lucky enough to grow up with a dad who had, extensive experience in firearms, and, not everybody necessarily has a parent that's there that has that knowledge. And, it's just something you should seek out if that's really what you're interested in, because you may decide that, this is really great. I think it's important that everyone learn how to defend themselves and have that ability. But at the same time, not everybody's cut out to do it. And you should just be honest with yourself about whether you are someone who is responsible enough to have a firearm. Are you going to be dangerous with it to yourself and to others, or are you going to be able to be safe with it and protect yourself and your family? If you can protect yourself and your family and responsibly store it, I highly recommend that you consider getting a firearm, because I think it's not just one of your constitutional rights. I think it's actually an obligation as a citizen, that you be there to be able to protect yourself, your loved ones, and the country if necessary.
So that's very similar to what I say. There's, and then I have my dad's test. So he would say to people, if a firearm is laying on the table and someone walks into your house and threatens you, can you pick up that firearm, point it at them, and fire it without hesitating? And it's interesting because some people say yes, like, okay. Some people are like, well, so then the answer is no. And now you're, potentially it's more dangerous for you to have that firearm if you're going to hesitate in using it, because now, the person who, broke into your house or whatever, maybe they didn't have a firearm, but now they're going to, right? So the situation is worse, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely my thinking about it. Although, I'm also open to the idea that perhaps you just haven't thought about it. I can, and there's also differences between sitting here having a conversation with somebody and actually being in the situation, right? Like, I can tell you that the first time when I was in Afghanistan loading magazines, thinking that I'm, potentially going to a gunfight with this, is a heavy moment. It's not, it's not like it was all through training and all through the rest of my life. And similarly, I use this story to explain to clients the idea of sometimes, making the life and death decisions for people, because you're picking people who are going to make your medical decisions and whether you should have life support. And people think about it flippantly sometimes and go, oh, well, they'll just pull the plug, they know I don't want to do it. And I'm like, no, stop, think about it for a second. It's one thing to say, it's hard enough to make that decision for your spouse. Now imagine what it's going to be like for your kids to be standing there in the hospital. Mm-hmm. The grandkids are standing around crying. You're in a hospital bed, potentially dying, and they're trying to make those life and death decisions. That is not an easy situation. And I highly recommend that you leave detailed instructions on exactly what you want to have happen to relieve them of the guilt and burden that you could impose on them, because you're not thinking through this and how that situation will play out in reality with a flippant, oh, well, they'll just pull the plug.
Yeah. Yeah. So true. There are, I mean, sometimes I think we miss the emotional and spiritual dimensions of decisions that we make. We think of them as being just very sort of utilitarian. But these other dimensions oftentimes are much more impactful. I mean, as a chaplain in the military, I saw that all the time. I remember a Marine coming to see me, and he was with combat camera. So his job, he had a rifle when they were going, house down, but his job was to take pictures to document whether they were successful or not. And I think he was more traumatized doing that than he would have been doing the actual, combat work, because he felt that somehow he was making their work more dangerous because, since he wasn't actively there to support the mission, they had to protect him while at the same time pursuing the mission, right? So all these things play into it, and it takes very careful thought to really parse through all those things. So I think your point is very well made.
Thank you. I'm glad you thought so.
Well, I'm looking at the time counter here. We're actually a little bit over time, so unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up here. But I mean, and there's so much more here that we could talk about. But really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story and also all of your knowledge about this area. You're absolutely right. I don't think there are too many people who are more experienced in this than you are based on your background. And it occurs to me, I think I need to refer you to a friend of mine who's he has a forensic video company, and he deals with a lot of this kind of stuff. I think you two would find a lot to talk about, because there's definitely a lot of crossover there. So Ben, thank you very, very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. It was a good time. It was a good conversation. I'm super happy that you invited me. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, you're welcome. So I'm going to have you hang tight for a minute while I wrap things up, and then we can talk offline for a moment. So folks, thank you very much for joining us. If you have any questions, and especially if you need a lawyer who can deal with firearms issues. So I will put Ben's contact information in the show notes. Feel free to reach out to Ben. And if you have, by the way, trust and estates issues as well, I'm sure he'd be happy to help you with those as well. I can tell you that one of my clients is actually going to be engaging Ben probably next week. So I was able to give him that news right before the show. So I can endorse him from that standpoint as well. So this is my last show for this week. We'll pick things up again next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time with Trust and Estates Weekly, and then the other shows during the week. So I invite you to tune in again next week. And in the meantime, wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and a great rest of the week. And signing off as I always do, Marie, darling, you are my belle. All the best.